Hello everyone and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah share. We're holding a Mishnah Berurah Chelik Aleph and we will be learning today Mirz Hashem Daf Nun Vav Amud Aleph and completing the very complex Siman Lamed Beis that we've spent so much time on with all of its complexities. Our learning today should be a Schus Refuah Shalema for Rabbi Amiri, the Yeshiva Shalom Ruvain ben Shima, who just had surgery yesterday and is actually right now experiencing some complications. Rabbi Hashem should have Rahmanas on him and on us, and he should have a Refuah Shalema B'Sar Shar Chayei Yisrael. So we pick up on Nun Hey Amud Beis, Siman Lamed Beis, Sif Mem Ches. 3 lines from the bottom, Nun Hey Amud Beis. Says the Mechaber, Im Tzipa Habatim B'Zahav. If you make a perfectly kosher pair of tefillin, and then you decide that it would be a nice idea to plate the batim with gold. Oy ba'or behema tameya. Or if you cover them not with gold, but with leather, but you use the hide of a behema tameya, of a non-kosher species of animal, psulim, these tefillin would be puzzle. Says the Mishnah Berurah Katan Reish Chaf Aleph, Oy ba'or. If you plate them cover them with hide, but with the hide of a non-kosher species of animal. Pirush, Mishnah Berurah says, what does this mean? Sha'asa oyer mitchila mi behema tahira. First, you went ahead and made batim properly out of the hide of a behema tahira, out of the hide of a kosher species of animal. V'achakach tzipa al oisai oyer mi behema tameya. And then you went ahead and you covered up that leather with the hide of a behema tameya. Afilu hachi pesulim, still in all, these tefillin are puzzle. Even though you made the bias proper out of the hide of a kosher animal, since you now went ahead and covered it with the hide of a treifa animal, now it is puzzle. Va'afilu chatach b'mkaim hashinin. And this is true even if you cut open a window where the shin is on the exterior of the tefillin sharosh, so you exposed the shin, shahashin nireh, so that the shin, both shinin, are visible. Still in all, Prima Gadim says these tefillin would be puzzle. Va'ayin be'bir halacha, he tells us to take a look at the bir halacha, dibra hamaschil tzipa habatim. If you take a look in that bir halacha, the Chavetz Chaim writes, ayin be'Mishnah Berurah b'shem ha-Prima Gadim. You take a look in the Mishnah Berurah and see what I quoted from the Prima Gadim, that when the Mechaber says that if you covered the tefillin with the or of a behemoth tameya, and you cut windows in it to expose the shinin, still and all, it's still puzzle. The Kasav Oid, the Prima Gadim further writes, Ha'ar kosher al gabe ar kosher v'shin nireh kosher. If you would take your batim and you would cover them up with another secondary layer of leather, but you would do it with leather from a behema keshera, then, as long as you cut open windows to render the shin invisible, that would be kosher. Even though the outer wall of the bias is not exposed to the outside, that would be okay, kevan shahashin nireh, since the shin is exposed. Prima Gadim says, based on this, if you would paint the tefillin somehow with some kind of a thick dye, de'en lachush, v'gam hashin nireh heitav, as long as the shin is visible, ad kan l'shaynai. Okay, let's go further. The second to last line, Nun Hey Amud Beis, in the Mechaber says the Mechaber, halacha l'Moshe miSinai. There is a halacha l'Moshe miSinai sheyu tefillin nitvarim begidei behema v'chaya tahirim, that the tefillin should be sewn closed using the gidim, the sinews of a kosher species of animal, a behema, or a chaya, or a non-domesticated animal like a deer. V'toiv litvar begidei shar, and it would be proper and good to use the sinews of an ox. Says the Mishnah Berurah Katan Reish Chaf Beis begidei behema. So you should use the sinews of a behema keshera, behema tahira, in order to sew the bottom closed. Says the Mishnah Berurah, v'loikhin me ha'okev shehem levanim. You should take sinews from the ankle of the animal, where those sinews are white. v'imhem kashim, and if those sinews are very stiff, merakechim ba'avonim, you soften them by beating them with stones, ad sheyasu kipishtan, until they become very similar to flax, to linen threads. And the truth is, if you were to look at a roll of gidin, if you ask a sofer or a batim to take a look at a roll of gidin, it is very similar to linen thread. We know that linen thread is not smooth. It has little bumps and little ridges on it. So too the gidin, they don't form such a smooth thread. V'toivin, you spin them, v'shoizrin, and you twist them, and that's how you make this gidin thread out of it to sew the bottom closed. V'das Magen Avram b'soif sif cotton samach vav. The Magen Avram tells us, Debe'inon bazeh hatfiyah lishma. When you do spin the gidin into threads, you have to do this l'shem kedushas mitzvahs tefillin. V'el Yerabba Pri Megadim efakfikin bazeh. The El Yerabba and the Pri Megadim take issue with that, and they hold that you do not have to make the gidin lishma. You don't have to spin them lishma. Reish Chav Gimel Tahirim. The Mechaber told us that we have to use the gidin of a kosher species of animal, but, and we've learned this already before, when it comes to the oir, the hide that we use for the batim, or for the klaf that we use for the parshios, while they have to be produced from a kosher species of animal, but it could be afilu min nevelos utrefos shelahem, that specific animal does not have to be a kosher animal. It doesn't have to be an animal that had a proper shechita and was kosher so that you could eat that specific animal. It has to be produced from a kosher species of animal, even if that specific individual animal turned out to be a treifa. Reish Chav Daled Begidei Shar, it's proper to use the sinews of an ox. V'im ein lo, if he does not have, Yikach Begidei Behemadaka, you could use the gidin, the sinews of a behemadaka, a small animal like a lamb or a sheep. Aval mitimeya, but from a non-kosher species of animal, afilu b'di'evet puzzle, those tefillin would be puzzle even b'di'evet, even if you already made them, those are puzzle. V'tzarech iyan imutar litfar begid hanashe brings up an interesting shaila over here, and that is, could you use the gid hanashe? The gid hanashe is not kosher. Could you use the gid hanashe or not? He says, v'tzarech iyan. Let's go to the bottom line of the Mechaber Nun Hey Amid Beis Sif Nun. Ein liknois gidim me einoi Yehudi. You're not allowed to purchase the gidim that you're going to use for the tefillin from a non-Jew. Mishum dechayshinon shemesh al behemoth tameyahem, because we need to be concerned, how do we know that these are actually the gidim of a behemoth tahira? If we purchase them from a non-Jew, to the non-Jew, he doesn't recognize that there's any difference really here if it's from a behemoth tameya or a behemoth tahira. He just wants to make a sale. So you'll ask him, are these from a cow? Yeah, they're from a cow. To him, it makes no difference. He doesn't see that it should make a difference to you either. So if we purchase them from an Eina Yehudi, we don't know that they came from a behemoth tahira, and therefore we should not purchase them from a Eina Yehudi. Says the Mishnah Berurah, this actually becomes very, very complicated. The Mishnah Berurah is now going to land us in the midst of one of the most complicated sugyas in Shas. So let me just give you a tiny little hakdama over here. This is something that we've spoken about before on the topic of bittul beroiv. We know that halachically, many times you could have something that is batal beroiv. When it comes to kashrus, you could have bittul beroiv. There are many places in halacha where we discuss bittul beroiv. Now, when it comes, one of the classic cases of bittul beroiv is somebody purchased a piece of meat. Now, there are 10 butcher shops in town. 9 of the butcher shops in town are kosher. 1 of the butcher shops in town is treif. We have in front of us a piece of meat, and we don't know where this piece of meat came from. Did it come from the kosher butcher shop, or did it come from one of the kosher butcher shops, or did it come from the treifa butcher shop? So there is a roiv here. Roiv of the meat in town comes from kosher butcher shops. There are 9 kosher butcher shops. There's only 1 treifa one. So we have a roiv. Can we employ that roiv or not? Now, obviously, I'm vastly oversimplifying this question, but this is just a classic case of the Gemara. I'm using it to bring out a halacha that we need for this sif. The Gemara tells us that the answer to this question is going to depend greatly on exactly where the suffix began. What is the suffix over here? Is it pshat that you went into one of the butcher shops and you bought a piece of meat, and now you're not sure which butcher shop you went into? I don't know which butcher shop I purchased it from. Did I purchase it from the treifa one, from the one treifa one, or did I purchase it from one of the 9 kosher ones? That's one way the suffix could be noilad. That's one way the suffix could have been generated. I know I went into the butcher shop and I purchased the piece of meat. I just have a suffix. I don't know which butcher shop I went into. The other suffix could be that we found a piece of meat, not in a butcher shop. We found a piece of meat somewhere else. And now we don't know where it came from. Now the suffix was not noilad in the butcher shop. Now the suffix is being noilad in somebody's kitchen. We have a piece of meat. We don't know where it came from. We don't know. Ostensibly, it came from a butcher shop, but I don't know which butcher shop it came from. And the suffix did not begin in the butcher shop. It's not that I know I purchased it from one of the butcher shops. Maybe somebody brought it here as a gift, and that person is gone. He's out of town already. I can't speak to him. But the shaila is noilad. The suffix is noilad in the kitchen. It's not noilad in the butcher shop. The Gemara tells us that we have to treat these two shailas very, very differently. When we're looking at the shaila that was noilad in the butcher shop, that suffix began b'mokim kviyusai. It began in the mokim, the kviyus, where the basar belongs, where the basar lives, so to speak. The Gemara tells us the klal kol kavua kemechzal mechzadami. Anytime we have a suffix on a davar kavua, on something that's located b'makom kviyusai, then we don't go basaroiv. Then we say kol kavua kemechzal mechzadami. Anytime something is kavua, it's in its place. We don't look at it as a question of a minority and a majority, of a miyut and a roiv. Instead, we look at it kemechzal mechzadami, and we cannot, it's like 50-50, and we cannot employ bittul. Masha'en kein, if the suffix was generated outside in the street, or the suffix was created in your kitchen, now we say called the parish meruba parish. Whenever something was separated from a group, now we say bittul. We have a piece of meat. It was separated from all the meat that was in the butcher shops. All the meat is located in the butcher shops. This piece of meat is no longer in the butcher shop. So we say called the parish. This piece of meat was separated from all the other meat. We say called the parish meruba parish. If it was separated from the rest of the meat, so we look at it, we assume it must have come from the majority portion of the meat. The majority portion of the meat is kosher. So here we have the great difference between these two shailas. If it's not kavua, if in the case where the shaila was noilad, the suffix began after the meat was already separated from the butcher shops, so now we say called the parish meruba parish. But when the suffix began in the butcher shop, I bought the meat in one of the butcher shops. I don't know which one. Then it's kavua. Then the shaila began when the meat was b'makom kviyusai. The meat, it was from where it belongs. Now called kavua kemechzal mechzadami. How does this play in over here? So let's take a look at the Mishnah Berurah Ois Katan Reish Chaf Hey, 4 lines off the bottom of Nun Hey Amud Beis. Techayshinan. What did the Mechaber tell us? The Mechaber said you cannot purchase Gidin from an Eina Yehudi. Why not? The problem is, says the Mechaber, we have to worry maybe the Gidin that the Eina Yehudi is going to sell you are not Gidin from a Behemoth Tahira. Maybe they're Gidin from a Behemoth Tameya. Now, the assumption going into this shaila was that the people do not slaughter and butcher animals in order to manufacture gidin. Why do people slaughter animals? They slaughter animals for food production. Once they slaughter the animal for food production, now they want to make use of every single part of the animal. So the intestines they'll use for kishka. The leftover fat they'll use for soap. The knee bones they'll use for pacha. What are they going to do with the sinews? Oh, there's a use for the sinews. Sofer and batim need gidin for stam. But nobody is slaughtering an animal in order to manufacture gidim. So we now have established that the assumption is the gidim will come from the roiv of the animals that are slaughtered. And the assumption seems to be that even by the Eina Yehudim, the roiv of the animals that was slaughtered for food production were kosher species. Apparently, it wasn't pork chops that they were all eating. They were all eating rib steaks. They were all eating beef or lamb or goats. But the roiv of the animals that was slaughtered for food production were kosher species of animals. They were behemoths tairos. That seems to be the assumption. So when we have gidin in front of us, right away there would seem to be a roiv that dictates that the gidin should have come from behemoths tairos, because roiv of the animals that are slaughtered are behemoths tairos. So now, how do we deal? Why do we have to be concerned that the gidim that we purchased from the Eina Yehudi might have come from a behemoth tameya? So let's take a look here in the Mishnah Berurah Kat Resh Chafei. Techayshina, we have to be concerned that if we purchase gidim from an Eina Yehudi, they might be from a behemoth tameya. Says the Chavetz Chaim, V'davka kishehu hoylech lebate hanachrim liknois mehem gidim. First of all, says the Chavetz Chaim, this whole suffix, this whole problem only exists if you go to the home of the Eina Yehudi. You're going to the Eina Yehudi's farm, and you're buying gidim from the Eina Yehudi in his farm. V'gam, and second of all, there's another factor that you need in order for there to be a shayla. V'gam yadu aloi, and you also have to know shemiktas min hanachrim hanoitlim hagidim mi behemoth tameya. You also have to know that some of the Eina Yehudim in town slaughter, let's say, chazerim, and they manufacture gidim from chazirim. So there are two factors here. One is, you know that there is a miyut of gidim that are being produced from behemoths tameos. You know that there are nachrim, you know that there are Eina Yehudim that are slaughtering chazirim, and they're using the sinews from the chazirim to manufacture gidim. So you have now established that there is at least a miyut of gidim that are being manufactured from behemoths tameos. And you went to purchase the gidim to the farm or to the home of the Eina Yehudi. Lachein, therefore, says the Chavetz Chaim, Afa pisha haroiv noitlin mitahira. Now, even though there is a roiv that tells you that the majority of the gidim available in town are tahirim, they come from behemoths tahiros, kevan shehu haylech eitzel nachri b'shah shehem kvuin b'batehem. But now, where is the suffix noilad? The suffix is beginning in the home or on the farm of the nachri. That's the makom kvius of the non-kosher gidim, the gidim that come from non-kosher animals, right? The nachri, if he's slaughtering chazirim, he's doing it on his farm. So if you go to the nachri's farm, that's the makom kvius of the gidim that come from the behemoth tameya. In that case, ein holchin achar roiv. Then we can't go basar roiv. Shekol kavua kemechtzal mechtzadami. Because now you have a shaila of kavua. This is like you went to buy the meat in the one tray for butcher shop. So where was the suffix noilad? The suffix was noilad in the butcher shop. So that's the makom kvius of the basar. Now you have to look at it as kavua. Called kavua kemechtzal mechtzadami. Now I can't say that, oh, pashtus, this piece of meat came from the roiv of the meat. No, this is not called the parish. You went to the butcher shop to buy the meat. That's called kavua kemechtzal mechtzadami. Over here too, you went to purchase the gidim from the Eina Yehudi. You went to the makom kvius of the nachri's gidim. And you know that there's a miyut of gidim that are from behemoths tameos. So called kavua kemechsal mechsadam, you can't go basar roiv. Aval, however, ima ovid gelula mehevi lashuk, but if the Nachri brought gidim to the marketplace to sell them in the marketplace, mutter liktais mimenu. Now you're allowed to buy from him, and you don't have the mechaber's problem. Shekevin sheperesh mikviyusai, because since the Nachri brought his gidim from his farm, from his home, and he brought them to the market, Aridon called the parish meruba parish. Now we say these gidim was separated from their mokum of kvius. Pashtas, they came from the roiv gidim in town. The roiv gidim in town are kosher, called the parish meruba parish. Unless you have a situation where it's not an open market. Let's say you have a flea market where people have stalls. So this Eina Yehudi has his stall. So he brings his products from his farm, from his home, and he sells them. It's Antonio's stall in the flea market. Well, in that case, his stall again has a din of kavua. And now again it becomes a shaila of kol kavua kemechza mechzadami az chayzer likviyusa. V'chein, it's similarly, imein yadua shemiksasa neitlan eisam mehemet tameya. Or, let's say, you don't know that there are some people that are making gidim out of behemoths tomatoes. As far as you know, all of the gidim in this town, everybody is slaughtering beef. They're all slaughtering, cows and goats and sheep. There's no pig farmers here. So I don't have the idea that there's a miyat of gidim that are coming from non-kosher animals. Then gamkein mutter liknois b'yam. Then again, you're allowed to purchase from an Eina Yehudi sharoiv gidim hey me behemoths tahores, because there's always a roiv that they come from behemoths tahores, and you don't have a shaila. You don't know that there's a miyat even that comes from behemoths tahores. Additionally, says the Chavetz Chaim, kol zeh begidin she'einon tevuyin. This whole shaila, this whole issue, only applies to gidim that are not spun into threads. Ava begidin tevuyin. But if you're buying gidim that are already spun into threads, that's a Magen Avram, then the Magen Avram holds that there's another problem. The Aser Liktais Behem, then you can't purchase gidim from an Eina Yehudi, even if there's a roiv, and even if it's not kavua, you still can't buy from them. Even if you know for certain that these gidim came from a behemoth Torah, you still can't buy them. Why? Because since we have a halacha l'Moshe Sinai that tells us that the batim have to be stitched together using gidim, so this is a primary midaraisa requirement for tefillin, that you have to have the batim sewn together with gidim. Therefore, tzarich sheti asiyasan lishma. Well, that means that we need lishma. Just like any other requirement of the tefillin, it has to be done lishma. So to the gidim, says the Magen Avram, have to be manufactured lishma. Utfias agidin, and the spinning of the gidim into thread, zuhi asiyasan. That is the asiyah. That's considered the manufacture of the gidim, and according to the Magen Avram, it has to be done lishma. V'nachrim lav b'nei lishmaninu, and a nachri can't do it lishma. He doesn't know what l'shem mitzvah tefillin means. We already saw earlier at the outset of this year that the El Yerabba and the Pri Megadim, they disagree with the Magen Avram, and they hold you don't need Tefillah Lishma on the Gidim. Okay, so here we had a fascinating concept, but the takeaway over here is we have halacha l'Moshe Sinai that we're required to sew and stitch the batim closed using gidim. The gidim have to come from a behemoth tahora. This is based on the drasha that we saw earlier. It says by tefillin lamantia teres Hashem beficha. We wear tefillin so that the teres Hashem should be, it should be inculcated into you. It should be beficha. It should be in your mouth, so to speak. And the Gemara Dirshu in Menachos, it has to be min hamutarim beficha, that the tefillin have to be manufactured from materials that are kosher materials. So the batim, the klaf, the gidim, the ritzuas we're going to see, everything has to be made from a behema tahora. In Sif Nun here, we saw that because of this problem, sometimes you cannot purchase the Gidim from an Eina Yehudi. Okay, now let's go a little bit further here. Top of Nun Vav Amud Aleph, top line in the Mechaber. Mokai Mishe'ein Gidin Mitzuyim. If you don't have Gidim available for use, Taifrem be Talidursh. You could use this Talidursh material. Sha'osim min haklaf. These are small strips that could actually be rolled or shaped into threads, but it's made out of klaf. It's not made out of the sinews of the animal. It's made out of the hide of the animal. So the Mechaber is saying that b'diavad, b'shas adchak, you can't get gidim. You could use this talidursh that's made out of the klaf, adchi is damnu lahem gidim, and you could use that until you're able to get gidim. When you're able to get gidim, you should fashion thread out of gidim. You should take out this talidursh, and you should sew the batim closed properly using gidim. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Katan Reish Chavav b'talidursh. Hein chutim anasim and aklaf. These are threads that are manufactured out of klaf. Uvamakam atchak sviralei kevedemineihu hem gidin atzmam uksherim litfar behem stam. The Mechaber holds that since it is made out of leather, it is made out of the hide of a behemoth tahira. Therefore, b'shas adchak, you could use it in the place of gidim. That's the shita of the Mechaber over here. Oiskan reish chav zayin ad sheyiz damnu, but this is only kosher b'shas adchak until you could get your hands on proper gidim. Kedei shaloi lehispatel mi mitzvahs tefillin. The Mechaber is allowing you to do this, so you should chas v'shalom be mevatel the mitzvahs asay daraisa of levishas tefillin. You don't want to be a kakafta deloi munach tefillin. So kedei that you shouldn't be mevatel the mitzvah of tefillin, b'diavad b'shas adchak, we're allowing you to use this talidursh made out of klaf. But certainly when you get gidim, yatirem, you should open up the batim and take out this talidursh, v'yitbar begidim, and you should sew it closed properly using gidim. There are those achrayim who are concerned, they hold that you cannot be yotze with this talidursh even b'shas adchak. Because if you look in the Brisa and Menachos, if you look at the Gemara in Shabbos, it says halacha l'moshe misinai that you need gidin. Doesn't say anything about any other part of the animal. It says you need gidin. The talidursh urhu shehu aklaf. The talidursh is not sinews. It's not gidin. It's hide. It's ur. So there are shitas that take issue with the Mechaber and say no, you cannot use this talidursh even b'shas adchak. We don't have a source in Chazal to say that you could use something manufactured from klaf for the tfiris. And therefore, based on this machlokes, if you don't have any other proper gidim to use, if you're going to sew the batim closed using something like this talidursh that's made out of or, out of klaf, instead of out of gidim, you should put the tefillin on, but you should do so without a bracha. So too, it's feasible to make a thread out of the intestines. If you have the small intestines of an animal, especially if it's from a behemoth daka, and they're dry and they're shriveled, they could be very, very small and thin, and you could fashion them into threads. So kimin chutim shel gidim ein litvar behem. You should not use them. The halacha l'moshe misinai hu dafka gidim, because the halacha l'moshe misinai tells us that you should use gidim. Oid kasvu, the achrayim also write she'ein litbar begidei oif tahar. We should not use the sinews of a kosher species of fowl, like a chicken or a duck. And you could see these very easily, by the way. If you take a chicken, you take a fertile chicken, take a leg, a drumstick of a chicken, cut along the base of the bone of the drumstick, and you'll see right away the thin little sinews over there. Without any further production, without any further processing, they already look like little threads. Says the Mechaber, you should not use those. Because who's going to tell us which parts of that chicken, of that kosher of fowl, what are called gidin, sinews, ve'ezamehen chutin, what are called threads, ve'ezamehen vridin, which ones are called blood vessels or other kinds of vessels. Va'anan gidin be'inon, and for us to fulfill the requirements of the halacha l'Moshe Misinai, we need something that are called gidin, sinews. And apparently, we don't have a Messiah exactly on the different parts of the bird, of the fowl, what exactly is called gidin, and therefore we should not use it. Okay. Now we get a little bit complicated. I actually wanted to manufacture something. I was going to cut something out of black paper, but unfortunately I forgot, so we'll see if we could manage without it. I hope I don't have to interrupt this year. But okay, let's see. Yitvar shaloisha tfirais b'chal tzad. We should make 3 stitches on each of the 4 sides of the bayis. So here I have my shalroish, and here you have the tfiras, the stitches on the bottom. I'm showing it to you on the bottom. You can see them on the top as well. Says the Mechaber, each side of the bayis should have 3 stitches. 1, 2, 3. And so too on all 4 sides. Right? 1, 2, 3. 3 stitches on each of the 4 sides. 3 times 4 gives us 12. And that is keneged the shiftei ka. That's keneged the 12 shvatim. So again, the Mechaber said, Yitbar shloisha tfirais b'chal tzad. We should have 3 stitches on each side. Says the Mishnah Berurah, nice cotton reish chav ches b'chal tzad. You should have on all 4 sides of the bayis. You should have 3 stitches on each side. Tam l'shtei esrei tfirais. The rationale for 12 tfirais. Neged shneim also shiftei Yisrael. This is keneged the 12 shvatim, the shiftei ka. Rabbi Isa, you see how much goes into tefillin? See what goes into tefillin? You're putting tefillin on your head. You're putting tefillin on your arm, right? Look at all the different symbolisms over here. And I don't think the Torah Dirshu was expecting us necessarily. Yes, we have to learn about it, and we have to know that the tfirais are keneged the shiftei ka. But I don't think that the Torah Dirshu was requiring us that every day when we put our tefillin, we have to know that this is keneged the shiftei ka, and but it's automatic. It's automatic. Like I mentioned in a previous year, my Rebbe in Yeshiva Tana, Rav Elia Schwartz, at Tzadik Levracha, he used to tell us when we put on tefillin, the tefillin should go into your mind, into your bloodstream. If you put on tefillin with machshava, with hirhur, if you put on tefillin with kavana, like the Yeshiva Zatzal used to say, you do a varma mitzvah. If you do a mitzvah with machshava, with intent, with kavana, and you have in mind when you put on those tefillin that you're being mekayim the mitzvah say daraisa, that Bari Olam commanded us to put on tefillin, right? And we're putting it on neged alev. Tayvais and machshavais libenu should be mushubadim to the Rabbanu Shalom. When we put on a shalroish, right? So that the machshavais that are in our moyach should be meshubed to the Rabbanu Shalom. Then all of these other things, the fact that the tfiras are keneged the shiftei ka, that automatically we are making use of the schus of the shiftei ka by putting on tefillin. It's a word, an English word that I'm looking for. It's escaping me right now. We are to make use of. It's just escaping me right now. We're im. Not imputing. I don't know. The word is just escaping me right now. But we are invoking. That's the word I'm looking for. When we put on tefillin, we're actually invoking the schus of the shiftei ka. So how much goes on when we put on tefillin that we don't even think about? Should think about it. So again, the Mishnah Berurah says here, Reish Chav Ches, Tam l'shtei esrei tfirais neged shneim also shiftei Yisrael. V'loi be'inon tfira toich habayis. We do not need that the stitches should go through the bias proper. Let's remember, this piece of the bias over here, this is what we call the ketzitza, right? The Mishnah Berurah is telling us over here. The Mishnah Berurah is telling us over here that the stitching does not have to penetrate the wall of the ketzitza itself. Now that's actually Shitas Rashi. Rashi held that the stitches went through the ketzitza. We don't paskin that way. So the stitches do not go through the wall of the ketzitza proper. Instead, the stitches are going through the titura, right? Let's get it onto the camera over here. Hello, camera. Focus on the tefillin, please. Right? It's going through the titura, not through the bias wall itself, but through the titura. That's what the Mishnah Berurah says over here. There's a lot in this. The stitches do not go through the ketzitza itself. Rak samuch lahabayis. They're just close to the wall of the bias, right? But they don't go through the bias itself. Trying to figure out which angle you could see it best on. Okay? It doesn't go through the wall of the bias. It's samuch labayis, close to the bias. Ve'ein toifrin, and we do not stitch it ketoifer begodim, the way a tailor stitches clothing, besvas habeged beli shiur. We don't make the stitches all the way up to the edge of the titura over here, the way a tailor makes stitches all the way at the edge of a garment. No. So we don't do it on the ketzitza. We do it close to the ketzitza. We don't do it all the way at the edge of the titura without leaving any space. Rather, we leave space between the stitches and the edge of the titura. Now here is where I was going to make something for show and tell, and I neglected to, but I think you know what I'm talking about, because I did this already once before with you. Just pulling out my shalyad for a moment, because that's going to assist in the show and tell. I wish I had a scissor or a knife over here, but I don't. Okay. Most of our tefillin nowadays, when you go to buy your tefillin, one of the hidurim that they tell you about your tefillin is that they're made out of or echad. What that means is everything that you see over here on this bias, this is all one piece of hide. It's a one piece of leather that was made into this shape. So, if I would undo the stitches over here of the tefillin, I could flap this open, right? I could open it up over here, and this bottom piece is like a door. I would open it up, and that would expose the inside of the bias. So the bottom of the titura, the door that could flap open, that's one piece together with the top of the titura, which is all one piece together with the ketzitza, with the bias proper. So basically they take a long piece of hide, they press the four batim into one side, and now you have like a long piece of leather with a bias, let's say, over here, right? So this was pressed up to make a bias, and this over here is a flap that flaps closed, right? Oops. 1 second. A better way to envision this maybe would be like this. Here I have a strip of paper. So imagine this was a piece of hide. What they did was they took a press and they pressed into one side of the hide and they fashioned a bias. So now on one side there's a bias. Then they took this. Now you see this piece here? This piece is what's the top of the titura. Now they bent this to make the bottom of the titura. And now we have, essentially, we have a bias of tefillin. We have the ketzitza. We have the titura, which is 2 layers. It's the top of the titura and the bottom of the titura. And here's the mabarta that the ritzua would go through, right? And here it is, right here. So it's all one piece of R. Imagine there's a hinge over here so that this could open up like a door. And the top piece of the titura, obviously, is open to the bias, right? Because they pressed the bias when they made this bias on the hide, right? They took this piece of hide and they didn't build something on top of it to make the bias. they pushed through, they pressed the leather. That's how they made the bayis. So this is all made out of or echad. But back in the day, they didn't make it out of or echad. It's not a requirement that it be made out of or echad. So back in the day, what did they do? I'll tell you what they did. They made a box. They made a ketzitza. So they made a box with 5 sides, but opened on the bottom, right? They made a ketzitza. Then they made a titura, right? Here's the titura, top and bottom. In the top of the titura, they cut a window. They cut an opening. Then they took the ketzitza and they pushed the ketzitza through that opening. If I had a knife here, I would cut it for you. Maybe I can. I don't have a knife, but I do have something sharp. No, not going to work. Okay. So they would cut an opening in the titura, and they would take the ketzitza, and they would push it through the opening. Now, it's not enough to push the ketzitza through the opening. Why? Because the Halakha L'Moshe Sinai tells us that the ketzitza and the titura have to be stitched together. So what did they do? What they did was, when they made the ketzitza, okay, here's your ketzitza. See how this is even on the bottom and it's flush with the sides? That's not what they did. When they fashioned the ketzitza, coming off of the base of the ketzitza on all 4 sides, they made flaps. Okay? So the wall of the ketzitza went down and then out. And it did that on all 4 sides. Down, out. Down, out. On all 4 sides of the bottom of the ketzitza. They folded those flaps down straight. They pushed the ketzitza through the opening of the top of the titura. And then they unfolded those flaps so that now those flaps are underneath the top level of the titura. They put in the parshas in the bias, and then they closed the titura. Now, when they stitch the titura closed, the stitches go not only through the 2 layers of the titura, but they also go through the flaps of the ketzitza that are sandwiched between the 2 layers of the titura. Now, when you stitch the bias closed, not only are you stitching the titura closed, you're stitching the titura closed, and you're also stitching the titura to the ketzitza by virtue of those flaps. Let's see this inside in the Mishnah Berurah. Says the Mishnah Berurah, we're in Ois Katan Reish Chav Ches, and we're like 2 lines into this Ois Katan of the Mishnah Berurah, right by the Ois Katan Reish Tes Zayin for the Sharat Tzion. Says the Chavetz Chaim, V'tzarich she'or habatim milamato lepiv, it is required that the hide of the batim, and by batim he means the ketzitza, it's required that the leather of the ketzitza, going down beneath its opening, okay, should be yiyu yoitzim mikol arba ruchaiseim. The leather has to extend outward on all 4 sides of the bottom of the ketzitza. That's that flap. On every side of the ketzitza, at the bottom, you need a flap coming out on all 4 sides. You yoitzim mikol arba ruchaiseim. We need to extend on all 4 sides. Ad sheyu magim tachas nikvei hatfira. So that, and now let's show you a real bias. Imagine that this bias was constructed that way. What the Mishnah Berurah is saying is that the or of the ketzitza, let's say the ketzitza was a different piece of leather than the titura. So it's not just a stovepipe stuck into an opening on the top layer of the titura. No, this piece, the ketzitza, has to have pieces of leather, flaps of leather, on all 4 sides at the bottom, so that they go in between the 2 layers you can almost see the seam. You can almost see the seam. The camera's not picking it up well, right? This opens. So the flap of leather that comes off the bottom of the ketzitza has to extend outward, and it goes between the two layers of the titura, so that when you stitch the titura, these stitches are going through not only the top layer and the bottom layer of the titura, but trapped between the two layers of the titura are those flaps that come from the ketzitza, so that you're sewing everything together. That's what it means, achiyu magiyim takas nikvei atfira. Those flaps have to extend outwards till the holes in the titura for the tfira, kedei sheyitfar or habatim mikol tzadim atitura. So that when you stitch through the titura, you're stitching the titura to the bottom. Veloika soifrim hamikatzrim or shalabatim. Not like the batim machers that are cheap on the leather of the ketzitza, she'enoi over holo takas nikvei atfira, so that the leather doesn't make it to the holes of the tfira. They only make tiny little flaps. What's the purpose of those flaps? They make tiny little flaps because if they wouldn't make flaps at all, then you would be able to pull the ketzitza right out of the titura. They don't want to do that, so they make tiny little flaps so that when they close the titura, they're trapping something of the ketzitza between the pieces of the titura so that you can't pull it out, but the flaps don't make it to the holes of the tfira. So the stitches don't go through those flaps. The flaps end too early. Says the Mishnah Berurah, do not do that. Then you're not stitching the ketzitza to the titura. All they're doing is they're sticking the ketzitza into the cutout of the top layer of the titura, but it's just stuck in. It's not sewn together. An aruba is a window. The Bar Shama wrote, "Shepasal kamet tefillin machmazeh." He parceled many pairs of tefillin because of this problem. Rather, it is necessary that we must stitch the two layers of the titura together with those flaps that come from the bottom of the ketzitza. When I say share next, I'll try to bring you an open pair of tefillin that were made that way, or I'll construct something out of construction paper to give you a little bit of a visual representation of what this means. I thought we were going to finish Siman Lamed Beis today. I see that we're not. I always forget how complex this is. I apologize for I hope that didn't shut my mic. I apologize for the inconsistent nature of the shiur over the last 2 weeks. Those listeners who are with me for a long time know for sure that that is not my style. It's just, there's a tremendous amount going on right now. Baruch Hashem, largely good. Making chasana very shortly. Everybody's home because of Ben Azmanim. A lot going on. And I took a week off, which you know I was loath to do. I thought that the shiur would be consistent this week. Unfortunately, it was not able to be. I even have a chasana tonight, but I made sure to prepare and say the shiur in advance. Hopefully, we'll get back on a solid track and we'll go back to our usual model of consistency. Again, I asked that everybody should be mispal for the Yeshiva Shlita, Rav Agayin, Shalom Ruvain, Ben Shima should have a refuah shalem b'sach shar chol Yisrael. Rabban Sham Sosa Torah should be megan against Klal Yisrael. Rabban Sham should send Yeshua's refuahs parnasset sheduvchim to all those in need, and we should be zeicher to see the Bias Gal Tzedek b'meher of Yameinu. Amen. Be well.